Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined by a very special guest. Some of my subscribers had told me about a professor that I had to have on my show, and so I looked him up. His credentials and his area of work and focus is amazing, and I knew we had to have him on this channel. And so I reached out. He has been so kind and courteous, and he has even given us some of his time here today. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce Dr. Florin Curta. Dr. Curta, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure. I mean, I've never used a channel of communication like this, so bear with me. I'll try my best.
Today's episode is going to be fascinating, and it's going to dive into a subject that many of you love, including myself. And it's not just the history of the Slavic peoples, but we're going to go a little bit further back and focus on their origins. But before we begin, Dr. Curta, for my subscribers who may not be familiar with you and your work, would you tell us a little bit about yourself today?
So I have a PhD in history from Western Michigan University and 2 MAs, one in history from the same university and the other one in medieval studies from Cornell University. I arrived here at the University of Florida, the campus, the quad on the campus of which you see right behind me, in 1999. So I've been teaching here for 20 plus. It has been my dissertation was on the early Slavs, but it has been a journey in the sense that although I came with certain ideas about research in mind, my students challenged me to go way beyond that. The first book, which was the dissertation I just mentioned, was published in 2001 under the title The Making of the Slavs, and that got the Herbert Baxter Adams Prize of the American Historical Association in 2003. I then published a number of books, on a more broader regional basis. 2006, Southeastern Europe. Recently, 2019, a companion with Brill on the whole of Eastern Europe, 2 volumes. I published this year, actually, although the book came out later last year, a sequel, so to speak, to the first book on the Slavs called Slavs in the Making. You see, the first book actually got its focus was more on the lower Danube region, now at the border between Romania and Bulgaria, a little further to the north, into Ukraine and the eastern part of Romania, the Republic of Moldova, but not too far to the north. So a lot of the people that actually wrote reviews or talked to me want to know, what do I have to say about those regions farther from the Danube and farther from the radar of the Byzantine sources, early Byzantine sources. So the second book, which, as I said, was published this year by Routledge, came out as a response to that, as also as a response to critiques about the way in which I dealt with the problems of language. Maybe we're going to have the opportunity to discuss more those issues, the problem of sources, and how a historian who has to wear many hats can deal with the different kinds of evidence. So I'm a professor of medieval history and archaeology at the University of Florida. I am also the co-editor of 2 series, one at Brill, very successful, on East Central and Eastern Europe in the Middle Ages, 450 to 1450. We just published volume number 75, so it's very, very successful, very large source. It has 2 purposes. Number one, to actually bring scholars from the region who do not necessarily or always write in English to the focus, to the attention of the English-speaking audience, either in America or in England, and promote on the same stage a number of young scholars, primarily from America, who have dealt with topics related to geographically, chronologically with Eastern Europe in the Middle Ages. The other series of which I'm the co-editor is at Palgrave Macmillan. It's the series as a new trends in the Byzantine history. So it's actually a series focused only on Byzantine history. whereas the other one is general for the entire region.
And to my subscribers, before we dive in, at the end of this episode, don't forget, check out the links in the video description below. It's going to take you to a variety of sources to where you can really dive in and take advantage of all the awesome work Dr. Curta has done and what he is currently working on. I can't recommend it enough. Give him all of your support. And now we're going to go for it. When you hear the term Slav, and especially in reference to late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, based on your knowledge and your research and even your imagination, what comes to your mind?
Actually, the word Slav, as we have it, is a late formation. The earliest term that came in the sources is sklavin, actually in Greek, sklavenos. And Slav or Sklavos is a contraction of that is attested a little later, both first in Greek, of course, and then in Latin. So the first thing that I think of when I hear this word is the history of the words. In other words, what caused that name to pop up in the sources and when it did and under what circumstances. There is a very interesting angle to this problem, the naming, that is, namely that we don't have any evidence that any particular group of people, in other words, territorially defined precisely, right, within a certain region at a certain moment in time, called themselves by that name. Linguistically speaking, the word is clearly not of Greek origin, at least because that those two consonants, S and L, next to each other, are very non-Greek, which is why in Greek as well as in Latin, between the two consonants, there's a C or K, as it were, right? So sklavenoi, sklavi, right? That's because in Greek, it would have been almost impossible to pronounce the sla, right? That's not a sound that sounds familiar to a Greek. So that seems to be a good indication that the name itself is, my paper to this, of native origin. Exactly what it meant in whatever the language from which it was taken, it's a huge debate. Some argue that it came from Slavic, from a Slavic language, and it is connected to the word slava, glory. So those are the glorious ones, if you want. Others claim that, in fact, that the origin is the word slova, which means word. So in other words, those are the people that speak this language as opposed to the other one. There's a very interesting theory here, namely that in Slavic languages, specifically in the East Slavic dialects of the Middle Ages, much later times, the speakers of Germanic languages, specifically Germans, were called Niemцы, which actually means dummies. In other words, those are the people who speak a language you cannot understand. A phenomenon very similar to what caused the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, to call Persians and others barbarians. Varvari actually means in Greek those that mumble. You cannot understand what they're saying. In other words, it's not a language that we people, the in-group use. The problem with this theory about names is that actually there's no shred of evidence. This is just as credible hypothesis as any other. However, at much later times, right? So beginning roughly with the high Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, and even early modern period, certain groups within this vast area in Eastern Europe inhabited by people speaking Slavic languages took that name, and some of them remain to this day, or were even given to the territories in which those people live. Both Slovenia and Slovakia are called so on the basis of this word. Few people know that in the Middle Ages, as late as the 13th century, way up in the north, in the northwestern part of present-day Russia, in the area of the town of Novgorod, another group, Slovenes, live there. So there's a tendency to see the name itself being applied to groups that were right on the boundary between the Slavic-speaking area and some other area, right? In other words, an area in which speakers of some other languages lived. In the case of Slovenia and Slovakia, clearly with the Germanic, or in the case of Slovakia, with Hungarian speakers. It's very interesting in the middle, right? So let's say in Bulgaria, in the Balkans, or in Ukraine. Those are not names that were, most of the names that we know from the Russian primary chronicle of tribes, right, have nothing to do with the word Slav. And in fact, the author of the Russian primary chronicle uses the word as an umbrella term. So to to end up my answer to your question, what I think of, based on my knowledge and research, as you call it, is an umbrella term, not unlike what one might think of the word Celts when hearing it.
That is excellent. Yeah, the whole time you were talking about that, I kept thinking about that exact thing. We use the term Celtic, or even, like Native American. It encompasses so many different peoples.
Probably the even better parallel is what is called today Hispanic, right? In America specifically, which is an exonym. That means a name given from the outside. I don't know of anyone who is called a Hispanic from the outside, calling him or herself Hispanic on a normal basis, because those people among themselves will always be Peruvians, Colombians, Ecuadorian, whatever, right? In other words, they will tend to go to the identity that is local. If they will take the Hispanic identity, it will always be in relationship, some kind of relationship to the state, funding, rights, group identity larger than Ecuadorian, Peruvian, or what have you. Very similar in the case of the Slavs. It was most likely a name given from the outside, probably based on some word or some local name, but clearly that went out. And it was used as an umbrella term for people who otherwise identify themselves very locally as Derevlians or Severians or Radimici or Tiverzi or whatever other tribal names they were there. So they were Slavs from the outside, not from the inside, so to speak.
When it comes to defining Slavs from a historical context or even an archaeological one of my patrons and subscriber, Alex, had asked, how are we able to actually tell?
Let me draw a distinction first, all right? Since there were two angles from which he asked this question. He mentioned historical context, archaeological context. You can tell from a historical context to the extent that you have written sources. Now, there are at least two problems, right? Number one, most of the early sources that we have about the early Slavs are not written by themselves, right? So you really have to wait quite long. Depending upon the angle you want to take here, you can think of the 10th century Letre, the royal court in Preslav in Bulgaria, writing under the rule of Simeon the Great, writing, as it were, translating from Greek into Old Church Slavonic, right? And as they were writing that, they did mention Slavs, right? They never mentioned it in, they had in mind as a linguistic group. In other words, to them, Slavs were those who spoke what we now call Old Church Slavonic, right? Or you can wait for the 12th century, early 12th century, for the last redaction of the Russian primary chronicle. And there, of course, the Slavs are, at the beginning, and there's even a story. It's the only, maybe not the only, but the first story that we have about where the Slavs came from, what's the origin, and so on and so forth. And again, it's very interesting that the author, or the authors, I should say, of the Russian primary chronicle did not think of the Slavs as a unique group. They or initially they thought of it as a group that then split into different tribes, right? So it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what specific authors meant by Slavs. It seems to me, if you are serious about actually looking at the primary sources, the region sources, it's always a moving target, and there are reasons for that, obviously. Namely, that there is a certain distance between the object described and the author. Most of those authors did not go in the field to interview people. Hey, are you a Slav? Can you tell me something about yourself? There's no such thing, right? Most of them were writing from the comfort of their chairs, somewhere in Constantinople, like Procopius and Jordanes, or in a monastery near Kiev, like the authors of the Russian primary chronicle that I mentioned to you. So they were never either close either in geographic or in most of the time, especially later sources, in chronological terms. Now, with archaeology, we run into problem too, but of different nature. We run into a theoretical problem, regardless of what ethnic group we're talking about here. Slavs, Franks, Celts, Vikings, you name it. There is no such thing, no object, no pottery, no fibula, no bracelet made in Slavia. Right? So there is no inscription like that. So the link between a certain ethnicity and material culture is always a construct of modern scholars, modern archaeologists, right? To the extent, I don't want to discuss right now whether it is a valid question. Some archaeologists even deny that ethnicity existed as we know it now in the Middle Ages. I'm not one of those people, right? But I would warn against a quick equivalence between any objects of material culture and a specific ethnic group. That we nowadays create, and most likely people in the past too, create ethnic boundaries via material culture is always a function of a certain political context, specific circumstances at the specific moment in time and place. So, if I may summarize this, the definition of Slavs will always depend upon the context. In other words, I cannot give you an encyclopedia/dictionary definition. Slavs means that 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Meanings. There's a multiplicity of meanings precisely because the word was used in a rather vague way initially, and then different authors at different moments in time applied it to their specific purposes. So you collect all that information and try to put them one top over the other. There is not much overlap. One comes, the tendency ever since the 19th century to say, well, they all were aware that those people were different because they spoke a different language that we call Slavic. The reality is that until the 9th century, we have absolutely no idea what was the language that those people spoke. And by the way, Old Slavonic is not the language in which somebody would go to the market to buy bread, ask for buying a bread or something like that. It's an artificial language created, really invented by one man. We know the name of that man, Constantine, otherwise known as Saint Cyril, right? Who used most likely, that's a theory too, used the dialect spoken in the hinterland of the city of Thessaloniki in northern Greece, right? To create this artificial language into which he translated the liturgical books in order to spread the word of God to people in Moravia, which is the eastern part of present-day Czech Republic. The same language was then used to convert to Christianity the society in Rus. Now, that in itself implies that people in both Moravia and Rus understood that language. Does it mean that their languages, their respective languages they were speaking when they were going to the market to buy their bread were similar? I would not go there. There is no basis for that. In other words, we don't have any other evidence written of what those languages were. So all inferences based on language are based on material that survives in much, much, much later times. So jumping over centuries, it's always a pretty risky business. No historian is happy doing that.
Alex had also asked, when it comes to the Slavs, who were they before they were Slavs?
There were no Slavs before the Slavs. In other words, it's almost like saying, where were the Americans before they became American? All right, like to give you an example. And obviously people will say, well, most of the settlers came from England. But were those who embarked in England already American? I doubt that, right? And is there an equivalent there? Let me explain my parallel here. That there was somebody before the Slavs are first mentioned in the written sources in the same area, living. There's no doubt, right? There's no point to it. It would be absurd to deny that. But we don't know how those people call themselves. Attempts have been made, and I will show you probably some images earlier on, of attempts are made to actually link the Veneti mentioned by Tacitus, so, Roman historian, or even some of the people mentioned by Herodotus, right? So 5th century BC, right? To the Slavs. To me, as a good historian, you have to exercise your critical skills and examine any hypothesis on the basis of the evidence that is there. Both Tacitus and Herodotus, in my opinion, had no clue or no inclination, no desire to actually satisfy the nationalist aspirations of people in the 19th century when those claims were made. So the only reason for pushing the antiquity of the Slavs before the 6th century, and they're first mentioned in the written sources, is simply because there's almost like a competition. Who's the oldest in Europe? And that very early on was linked to claim to territory and influence. In other words, to political power. But a historian is not supposed to do that. And in fact, I would go as far as to say if a historian's job is any that could be described in a few words, is to actually destroy illusions. The illusion of pushing the Slavs back into history is just like, as I mentioned, I mean, there's no point of linking Americans to the Englishmen or women who left England. Evidently, there is a link between the two. Evidently, there were people as I mentioned, there's no denial, but there's no point in believing that the identity that we call Slavic came frozen in time, fully fledged from, let's say, Bronze Age all the way to the modern age. There's no such thing. That would deny history. Change.
What do we know about where they actually came from originally?
As you can tell, the maps that one can find on Wikipedia or other avenues, to get quick information, seem to rely on a theory according to which the homeland of the Slavs, the area from which they came from, as you mentioned earlier on, would be along or on both sides of a river shown here on my map here. This is the one just underneath the word Slavs on this map is the river Pripet, which is right at the border between present-day Ukraine and Belarus, the northern border of Ukraine. Just as an aside, this is the area where Chernobyl is. That's where the accident took place, which another side means that not too many excavations will take place in that area for like 2,000 years from now. If you think of the radioactivity in the area. Anyway, how did we come up with this? In other words, let me explain why this area of all the regions in Europe, or in fact Eurasia, was why was this area chosen as the source of the Slavs? If you are examining closely what's going on, it's not archaeological evidence, nor indeed written sources, because this area this is the Danube, right? This is where the Byzantine Empire was. This is way too far to the north, was outside the radar of. I doubt that anybody in Constantinople knew about what the Pripet River is, where it is, and who lived there. And they most likely didn't care either. So what is the evidence? The evidence is linguistic. It's a long story to be told here, but for the purpose of the answer to this question, it is on the basis of the examination of modern Slavic languages that this epicenter, if I may use that word, of the Slavic language, the spread of the Slavic languages was chosen. Now, the problem with linguistic evidence is that it cannot be dated with any degree of accuracy in the absence of written sources that freeze, so to speak, those linguistic phenomena like phonetic changes, new lexemes, and so on and so forth. So there is no way to tell actually when this happened. If this was the first homeland of the Slavs, on the basis of language alone, one cannot tell. This is where archaeologists jumped in, right? So because their thinking was influenced already by the theories in historical linguistics, they started from the premise that it must be here that the first culture of the Slavs, and in a sense of archaeological culture of the Slavs, must be found. And as you can tell, the arrows will show how they spread later on into different areas. Leaving aside the fact that this actually looks more like a staff map, or a map of the general staff of an army, or something like that, than an archaeological thing. By the way, a Soviet historian, Nikolai Derzhavin, did say that in fact those arrows would describe both the expansion of the Red Army during and after World War II, and that of the Slavs, right? But going back to what I was saying, a very serious examination of the evidence that we have will show that, in fact, the earliest assemblages, the earliest signs of material culture, right, in an area that we know from the written sources was inhabited by the Slavs is here at the Danube, at the end of the era, not at the beginning of the era. Moreover, the archaeological assemblages in this area are earlier by at least 100 years than anything here in the presumed homeland. That's contrary to the idea of a migration, obviously, right? And there are no signs of a big population leaving this area, leaving it empty, as it were, and moving into all those areas. On the contrary, as we move from the 5th to the 6th to the 7th century, this area here actually increases in population, which again is against the model of a migration from the outside. So, direct answer to your question, where were the earlier Slavs? If one is serious about doing this proper way, then the earlier Slavs are those of the Danube here, right? Lower Danube, right here at the end of the arrow, because this is the area where, in fact, the early Byzantine sources learned about those people. Did they live there from the very beginning? That's one hypothesis. Did they come from the outside? That's another hypothesis. In other words, the one that is shown here on those maps. Not only there is no evidence historically / archaeologically speaking for the homeland of the Slavs being here at the border between present-day Ukraine and Belarus, but there is no evidence of migration either. Now, maybe we're going to have the opportunity to see there is evidence of raids of the Slavs across the Danube into the Balkans. But at every single event like that mentioned in the sources, the authors giving us the stories tell us that the Slavians went back home, meaning in the lands north of the Lower Danube. They did not settle there. In order for the earliest evidence of settlement in the Balkans to arrive, you have to wait for the first half of the 7th century. So 200 years after the presumed migration. Boy, they move slow, if they moved at all. So what's the alternative? In my second book, and I mentioned in the introduction there, I argue that for languages to spread, because remember the initial argument that resulted in the location of the homeland here was linguistic in its nature, right? So returning to that category of sources, the only way to explain the spread of the Slavic languages is not migration. Let me explain. At no point in history and at no point on planet Earth, a group of people moving over large distances like this will preserve intact the language in their homeland over 300 years. Remember what I said, that the Old Church Slavonic, created artificially by Saint Cyril on the basis of a dialect in the hinterland of Thessaloniki here, was used to convert the Moravians first in the 9th century, and then in the 10th century to convert the Rus here. All right? Supposedly that is an indication that the dialects in all this area were the same. It's impossible if one starts from the assumption of migration. And it's quite clear why. Because in the process of migration, the migrants get in touch with other people speaking other languages. And they are not blocking themselves, they're not isolating themselves. They borrow expressions, sounds, words, and so on and so forth. I dare you to claim that the English spoken in Oklahoma is the same one that is spoken in Yorkshire, England, or in Australia, right? And you see what I'm saying, right? So there is no way. So what other mechanisms are for the linguistic spread that explains the modern distribution of Slavic languages, which led to this theory of where it starts? One of the phenomena that has been studied by linguists recently is what is known as koine. The term is Greek, and it refers to a phenomenon where languages that are not necessarily different from each other, but they are from the same family, merge to create a line of communication that actually enables people from different languages to communicate among each other. Linguists clearly say that Slavic is very close to the Baltic languages, like Lithuanian and Latvian nowadays, right? There's also a very strong Iranian influence. And finally, there's a strong Dacian / Thracian origin. So somewhere in the intersection of all those languages, probably a little further south from the Pripyat region here, is where the Slavic language may have come into being. But that's not Slavic people, you see. It's quite possible that the language spreads without people moving.
My patron Alex Lindgren had also asked, how did Slavic culture and even language come to spread across Eastern Europe?
The Slavic, what archaeologists call Slavic cultures, did not actually spread much. There has been a tendency to see Slavic culture defined by specific elements found in archaeological assemblages. Some have gone for a typical house, usually sunken into the floor by about 50 centimeters for purposes of insulation. It's warmer, it's easier to warm out in the winter, and it's obviously cooler in the summer, right? So those people lived underground, so to speak, but for the purpose of living well. And you know, a lot of people jumped and say, well, see, you can find this type of houses only in Eastern Europe, in the areas that are known to have been inhabited by the Slavs. Actually, that's not true. Anglo-Saxon archaeologists discovered in England a number of, they're called sunken feature buildings. That's the technical word for it. At Mucking, for example, a well-known and published settlement. I doubt that there were any Slavs living in the area there. So it's a feature that is not ethnically specific. That's what I mean. Others jump to saying, well, ugly handmade pottery with no decoration whatsoever, the so-called Prague type. So-called because the first discoveries were made in the outskirts of the city of Prague in at that time Czechoslovakia, and were published by a Czech archaeologist of Ukrainian origin, Ivan Borkovsky, during the war. His is the first book to have made that claim that the specific type of pottery is ethnically attributable to the Slavs. The problem, of course, is that handmade pottery is not made with the purpose of mind to send a signal, hey, I'm Slav. It's made with the purpose of actually doing some practical stuff, holding the milk, cooking the soup, whatever, right? And needless to say, the proportions and size of all those pots were found in other cultures as well. Now, the culture then itself is not specific to only one side. In other words, clearly, there are similarities between sites at a distance from each other. Within an area, let's say, of a size of probably half of the state of Florida, those are modes of thinking that archaeologists in America use in the same way, all right? What is the area of the Timucuan culture in north central Florida, right? So you can delineate it by putting on a map all the finds known so far, and you sort of draw the line between them and say, this is the area of the Timucuans. It's hard to believe that people that actually share the same material culture actually are of the same ethnic identity, for the reasons I mentioned earlier on, right? So once again, material culture could spread to people who are not necessarily of the same ethnic group, not even speaking the same language, right? Nike shoes are in many places on this planet, right? They're not inhabited by people who speak English, much less being American, right? So the connection between the two is different. Now, with language, however, with this linguistic spread, the issues are a lot more complicated, right? One of the phenomena that linguists have pointed to is the so-called lingua franca. That's a phenomenon specific to the Middle Ages, when a number of Italian merchants in the city-states like Genoa, Venice, and so on and so forth, that got in touch around the Mediterranean Sea with groups of people with whom they were trading, speaking other languages, created a language ex nihilo, so to speak, which was not Italian, was not Arabic, was not this, was not that. It had a basis of sort of like a foundation of a Romance language, Italian or something like that. But it had so many added features that, in fact, it was a completely novel language. And it helped communication for the purpose of trade, right? I don't think that's the case with Slavic. What I explained to you earlier on is rather koine. You see, it's not something that was imposed from the outside for the purpose of trade. Clearly, Slavic did not come into the area where trade would have been big. On the contrary, it was rather remote. Nor was it imposed by an empire or an economic power that wanted to rule or govern the area. One could make the case, however, that the koine once formed. Let's play. We don't know for sure. Those are my ideas, not my hypotheses. They were proposed by others, but I adopted them. But they're just as good as yours or anybody else's. Let's say koine was already formed. The Slavic koine was already formed by 500, right? Within a century after that, the area that we're talking about here is dominated by a great political power, that of the Avars, who are not speaker of Slavic, right? However, move another 200 years later, around 800, there is evidence that the Avars speak Slavic. Does it mean that they have adopted the Koine in the same way, or probably the Koine had now become, within the Avar Khaganate, a lingua franca, like described earlier on? There are arguments in favor of both ideas, but you can see how we moved away from the model of linguistic spread by means of people moving. We're talking here about political, economic, and social ways by which a language spreads.
And as we leave off finding out that very interesting information on the Avars speaking Slavic, that leads me to ask my next question. Alex had also asked, when it comes to the Slavic peoples and Slavic culture, was it influenced by anyone around them?
There is no culture or any people that lives in isolation. And definitely this is the case with the Slavs as well. The earliest influences that we know of, even before we can begin to play with, even before we have the first written sources, so we begin to actually try to figure out, okay, they place the Slavs here. What material culture has been found in the area? Can we attribute it to the Slavs? It's guesswork. But before even doing that, there are clear evidence in the language, right? Or in the languages, should I say, of multiple influences. I mentioned already a very strong, I don't know if it's called an influence, some linguists who believe that it was actually a single language, Balto-Slavic, that's split into two, Baltic on one hand and Slavic on the other. There's very, very strong connection there, very strong connection. There is some Germanic influence, right? Even the name of the Danube in Slavic is of Germanic origin. I mean, the Slavs learn about the name of the river from speakers of a Germanic language. There are very strong influences, Iranian, right, from Iranian languages. Exactly who, I mean, I say Iranian, I don't mean Persians necessarily. Could be a population in the steppe land, such as the Sarmatians, for example, who we know spoke an Iranian language. There is some influence from Turkic languages, probably from the Avars or Huns. I mean, it's very difficult to pinpoint where those influences came from in specific people. That's what I mean. And also to date them, at what point in time they came in. But it's very interesting. There's a very new, I should say, trend in linguistics right now. It's called contact linguistics. What happens when two languages come in contact with each other? And the tendency has been to actually look at what words were borrowed in what language, right? So just to draw lists of words. But the contact situation could be a lot more interesting from a social point of view. Hence, the new discipline in linguistics called social linguistics. Think, for example, of Spanglish in America, right? Which is usually perceived from the outside by speakers of English only as a sort of like a weird phenomenon. Some would go as far as to say that the speakers of Spanglish do not know proper English. Nothing could be farther from truth. In fact, those are speakers of two languages which map structures from one language onto the other to create often an almost secret language to communicate only within the group, so that outsiders will not understand what they're saying. You recognize some words in English, but the rest of them is gibberish. You don't have a clue, right? So in many respects, I think that's exactly what happened with Slavic. Borrowing words from one language to adapt them to Slavic with maybe not different meanings, but for different circumstances. It has been shown, for example, that the contact with Germanic seems to indicate very heavy lexical borrowings. So of all the areas of a language, the Slavs took from the speakers from Germanic words. There is evidence of contact. I forgot to mention this. There's evidence of contact between Slavic and Romance languages. More exactly, the Romance languages spoken in the area of the Lower Danube, the ancestors of present-day Romanian. Okay? The influence there is grammatical, morphological. Not so many words as structures, right? The way you construct a phrase, the cases of the nouns and things like that. That would imply a very close connection, and contacts at an equal basis, but very close quarters. Think of getting your wife from one group and married into the other, that kind of stuff. Whereas the lexical borrowings from Germanic imply a contact that was socially inferior, superior, right? Exactly how that played out in history, I don't know. Your imagination is just as good as mine. But linguists say that when only lexemes are borrowed, that's an indication that the language from which they are borrowed is the language of the people who are the masters. So they're socially and politically superior, right? So that only the languages will tell you that there are a number of issues there. Now, in material culture, plenty of evidence, right? Very interesting. Although the sources tell us that the Slavs usually fought on foot, right? In the area where the Slavs are placed by the written sources, there are quite a bit of indications that they raised horses, and they probably fought on horseback. Where could that influence come from? Steppe people, most likely Avars. There is, in fact, a clear source, 7th century chronicle attributed, because we don't know the real name of the author. In the 19th century, the author was called Fredegar, but that's not his real name, right? The Chronicle of Fredegar, let's put it this way, written from a Frankish perspective in Latin, that tells a story about how the Avars, spent the winter in Slavic villages, sleeping with the wives and the daughters of the Slavs, right? In other words, clearly in a situation of abuse. The Avars are the masters, the Slavs are the inferior, socially inferior there. They cannot actually defend themselves for that sexual abuse, right? And actually the source says that the Slavs are subject to other dues. They pay tribute to the Avars, right? And they are called befulki, which actually means that in a situation of battle, the Avars will push them in the front line to be the sort of like a cannon fodder. Here we have a clear situation like the one I told you. Now, the question is, there's no evidence in the text I mentioned to you, but one would wonder, what was the language in which the Avars spoke with those Slavic women with whom they slept? You see what I'm saying? I doubt that the Slavic women learned Avar language. And it's a possibility, therefore, that the influences were both ways, not just one. In other words, there is evidence of Slavic influence upon Germanic languages. And definitely there is influence of Slavic languages upon Romance languages. Romanian is full of Slavic words. And in a situation in which, as I mentioned to you, borrowings from one language to the other are adapted to the needs, Romanians, for example, did very funny things with Slavic loans. For example, the word for science in Russian, nauka. There is a similar word in Romanian, nauk, that actually means dummy. I guess that's how you get when you study too much science.
That's interesting, man. That would suck, dude. Like you get your family is basically abused. You can't do anything about it. And then on top of that, they make you the cannon fodder of their army.
Fredegar tells us that they rose in rebellion and they defeated the Avars and created a state that's called the state of Samo, the first known state in history, Slavic known state in history. The story that I told you was the explanation of why they rose in rebellion and were successful and so on and so forth.
When it comes to all people, civilizations, cultures, everyone loves an origin story that explains, a lot of times often mythically, where they came from. And so Alex and many others had actually asked when I was polling for questions, did they have their own origin stories? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about what they were?
The earliest text in Old Slavonic that we have no such story. Let's put it this way. So the stuff created in the 9th century, second half or last third of the 9th century, and the 10th century in Bulgaria, using that language, Old Slavonic, invented by Constantine Cyril, no such story. As I mentioned to you, the word Slav is mentioned there only as a group of people able to speak this language, Old Slavonic. To express their devotion to God. Okay, that what I just said is an explanation for why there is no origin story early on, because the emphasis was on the language. Therefore, it didn't matter where you come from, to the extent that you speak the language. and you could be an Avar, for example, that speaks Slavic, and you receive Christianity via that makes you Slav. All right. So what the origin of the group as such, as a speakers of a language is obviously irrelevant here. If you look for that specific origin story, then the first one that we have is in the Russian primary chronicle, right? And what that is, I mean, it would be a gross mistake to call it a genuine, should I say, folksy kind of stuff that the Slavs invented, because you just read it and you realize that, in fact, what the author or authors did was to link the Slavs to biblical history. They are the descendants of Japhet, and they are placed in human history coming down like all the other peoples from the Tower of Babel and spread of languages and so on and so forth, right? And the purpose of the author of, or the authors of the first part of the Russian primary chronicle was not so much to focus on the Slavs, but to explain why, coming from this biblical history, they were unable to govern themselves. Because the purpose of the author was to say, look, they got so bad, they could not work together there with their neighbors, right, with the Chuds and the others, that they had to invite the Varangians in, Rurik, Vikings. And the purpose of the author is to actually explain why the Vikings became the rulers of those people and eventually change their language and change their ways to become Slavic. That in itself is an origin story, but not for the Slavs, for the Rus. If you look for other Slavic people, for example, in Poland, right, there is no origin story for that. There is an origin story for the dynasty, Piast dynasty, that ruled in the Middle Ages, right? According to an anonymous, again, we don't know who the author was, it's conventionally known as Gallus Anonymous, who wrote in the early 12th century, about the same time, a little later than the last redaction of the Russian primary chronicle. Piast was a peasant who received some guests that could not get hospitality at the local duke's house. So they came into the peasant house, which is, sure, I don't have much, but sit at the table. So it's a desire to actually explain the origin of the dynasty, not of the people. Bohemia, Cosmas of Prague, again, 12th century. He, again, explains the origin of the dynasty, the Przemyślids. Przemysl was a plowman. Once again, modest origin, like in Poland, no origin stories in Bulgaria, no origin stories in Serbia. And I could go on and on.
As many of my subscribers know, one of my channel favorite topics usually involves DNA and how it helps explain a little bit about the past. Usually we focus on the ancient world, but this one may be a little bit later. And so I was wondering, in the world of DNA studies, has it told us anything about them?
There has been breakthroughs in the discussion of migrations, right? Not so much with DNA analysis as with other forms of what is called molecular anthropology, such as strontium or oxygen isotope analysis on the teeth, that very simply could tell where you drank your water as a kid, right? And therefore, because as a kid you grew up in that area, where you came from, okay? With the groups of population discovered by archaeologists, right, that they or others call Slavs, there are problems. One of which is that the dominant burial rite throughout the early Middle Ages, before Christianization, before conversion to Christianization, was cremation, not inhumation. DNA analysis on cremated remains is not impossible, but it's only now that, it's very difficult because of the high temperatures, of the messing up, all and so on and so forth, right? Needless to say, there are problems of contamination in cremation that are, so for the procedural modes are much more complicated issues. That's one. Two, even for cases other than the Slavs, right, where DNA has been used. There are two ways to do it. Okay, and I'm not. I don't know whether you insisted upon this, because it's a very important thing to understand what DNA analysis can do and how it works. One can compare DNA from a modern population of, say, Bosnia, right, to DNA extracted from skeletal materials from a cemetery dated supposedly to the 10th century, 11th century, in the Middle Ages, okay? So compare the DNA of a medieval population with the DNA of a modern population. Say, look, if they match, wow, I mean, if the cemetery happens to be somewhere else, let's say in Poland, the match would mean that there's a migration or something like that. If there's none, any interpretation is possible. But that's one way to do it. Modern to old. Okay. A much more interesting, I would say, at least for me, way to do it is to compare DNA from two old populations, cemetery A and cemetery B, or even within the same cemetery, between individuals buried in different parts of the cemetery. Okay. The latter way is very useful because it creates a map of the population. In other words, unfortunately, not that many samples exist for the moment. In other words, there's no way to map the old population within a single chronological segment. Say the Middle Ages, much less at the scale of a single century. I wish we were there, because that would be very interesting stuff. Because, let me put it this way, it will show not necessarily where people come from, but what their marital strategies were. There's been a phenomenal book published on a subject completely different from what we talked about here. History of Florida, where I'm based, right? You probably know that the Native American tribe in Florida, the Native American tribe, is the Seminoles, who did not exist as a tribe before contact with the whites, okay? So the native population of Florida at the moment of contact with the Spaniards is wiped out, not by war, but by the diseases that the Europeans have brought. Long story short, there's a gap of population, a demographic collapse. Florida, especially the northern and central parts, were empty of any population around year 1600s. That's when small groups of people moved from southern Georgia, right? Usually from, linguistically speaking, linked to groups of Cree, right? But mixed up with runaway slaves, hence the Black Seminoles, right? And all sorts of other groups, right? Those are isolated, one group here, one group there, and so on and so forth. Now, nobody marries within the same group for obvious reasons. So you need a wife from elsewhere, right? Now, most people think that marrying is dictated by the language, the customs, the culture. In other words, you take your wife who is similar to you in culturally speaking. As a matter of fact, Chris Stojanovsky, who wrote this book, who did a phenomenal study, both archaeology and molecular anthropology, came to the conclusion that, as a matter of fact, it is marriages that created a Seminole identity. It is by marrying to outside groups that those groups, small groups, began to coalesce and formed what we know nowadays as the Seminoles. Now, that is where I wish I could give you an answer about the Slavs, but we're not there. The reason we're not there is that because there's an obsession with comparing modern to old DNA. And that, to me, is a fundamental mistake. It may be fashionable. It gets 5 minutes of attention on TV. It gets Ancestry.com, that kind of stuff, right? But it is based on a wrong assumption. There is no ethnic DNA. There is no Slavic DNA, Frankish DNA, Romanian, and so on and so on. There is no such thing. Ethnicity is a cultural thing, not a biological thing, right? Moreover, if you compare a modern to an old, ancient, medieval DNA, you're denying a history of a lot of mixing that could have happened. Now, clearly, as I mentioned earlier on, if the modern population DNA does not match or matches the DNA of the old medieval population, say at a remote location there, the immediate thing is, migration. But there is no way to tell when that migration happened. Remember what I said about linguistic facts. They cannot be dated in the absence of written sources. The same happens to haplogroups. There is no date on the haplogroups. The only dating, if you read the literature, you'll see that most of the authors trying to put those things in a chronological order, when they come to a timeline, they usually use sources from the outside, not from internally. They say, okay, this must have happened when Procopius was saying such and such, or when the material culture, archaeological culture, such and such spread in the territory. In other words, they bring outside evidence to mix with this to explain their own facts. They cannot date those things by themselves and in themselves. And without that, there is no trust. I cannot trust information that is made up in this way, if you know what I'm saying.
And now let's talk outside sources. When it comes to people who would have seen these people or heard of them at least, whether they be Byzantine or Frankish, Latin, whoever, what did they have to say about the Slavic peoples?
Very good question. The earliest author to write about them is Procopius of Caesarea in the mid 6th century. Right? There are others who claim that Jordanes is the first, other that pseudo Caesarius in a dialogue, but chronologically speaking, Procopius is the first. What was he interested in? Warfare. He wanted to understand them as fighters because they caused problems to the empire. But he, like many educated Byzantines at that time, believed that the customs, the way people behave, laws, and so on and so forth, was determined by the climate, we'll say nowadays, under which you live. He thought that the world was divided into slices, right, called climes. That's the theory of climes. Tell me under what climb you live, and I'm going to tell you, I'm going to predict what kind of culture and what kind of behavior you would have. That's why the Byzantines were scornful towards people from the north, because they thought they were coming from an area that did not have much sun. So therefore their brains were mushy. They were very violent, they were very brave, but they were stupid. They could not understand much. That's what the Byzantines thought. And that's why they also left the area, because being stupid and not having much to do in the cold air, they had sex and they bred, and lots of people, overpopulation, you gotta get out. That's the theory that Jordanes, Procopius' contemporary, used to explain the migration of the Goths. Right? So the Slavs were in a similar package, so to speak, because most Byzantines were not interested in specificity of those people. They're all the same, all they're coming from the same area, because they looked at them with that sense of superiority, the civilized man, the educated man, and so on. Towards the end of the 6th century, we have a better example of this in a treatise written, again, we don't know the author. The title of it's a manual. It's a manual called Strategikon, which in Greek is translated loosely, military manual. It's a manual for officers, high-ranking officers in the Byzantine army, how to fight with different groups of people. And there's a substantial chapter on the Slavs, very interesting. Most likely based on observations of somebody who had been in Emperor Maurice's armies that crossed the Danube and waged war within Slavic territories right there, because it's full of details that are, for us as historians, is fantastic. For example, he says, those people are not hungry. They have plenty of food, which they store underground. Their wives sacrifice themselves at their husband's death, sati, like in India. They are, when they take prisoners, they're not treating them badly. So don't be afraid. Some of those prisoners even decide to stay among them. That's how nice they are treated as prisoners there. So all those snippets of information they give us there, clearly all the examples that I gave you are from the point of view of a military man. I want to know about the enemy, details that will help me defeat him, right? So there is no, in other words, those sources cannot answer questions such as, what was the language they spoke? Absolutely no interest in that. Were they related by customs or culture to other people? No interest in that, absolutely. There is a classification that the Byzantine authors made. The Slavs are not like the Franks. Why? Because to the Byzantine mind, the Franks are fighting in a certain way. And by the way, the Franks and the Slavs are not like the Avars. The Avars are different too. Why? Because they fight on horseback, right? So there are different ways to approach this from a military point of view. It is only late, very late, that you see an interest in the Slavs as a linguistic group. It's only late that you see, when I say late, after the 10th century. 12th, 13th, 14th century sources begin to actually give us detail about language, differences between Czechs and Poles, Russians, Ukrainians much, much later, and so on and so forth. But in the early times, no.
I'm going to ask an additional follow-up question right now. So we've covered, especially how the Byzantines saw them. Were there any similar views, even if just combat, that was expressed by, let's say, sources in Western Europe?
Yeah, I mentioned Fredegar earlier on. In the process of, so remember the Slavs revolted against the Avars, right? he actually calls the sons born out of the sex that the Avars had with the Slavic women, he calls them wends, not Slavs. And that seems to have been the way in which to this day in Germany, in certain areas in Austria, in dialect, that's the way to call the Slavic neighbors, Wendish, right? Wends. And he says that those Wends were extremely good, militarily speaking, so much so that King Dagobert, king of the Franks, sent an army against Samo, their ruler, and was beaten. So again, he wants to explain how was that possible. Unlike Procopius and the Strategicon manual, there are no details about wives and things like that. It's mostly about Samo, right? About the ruler. In other words, the Franks tend to attribute any merits not to the population, but to the head, to the king, to the ruler, to the chieftain. Early sources in Latin writing about the Slavs are also some of the letters written by Pope Gregory the Great around year 600. And those are snippets in correspondence between him as a pope and other bishops, right? And he says, oh, by the way, I heard that the Slavs invaded such and such. So those are not clearly no information then, again, from a military point of view, but mostly in terms of move away, they're coming, that kind of stuff. Finally, there is evidence in later centuries, right, of an interest in the Slavs. We have to wait for the 9th century for a catalog of Slavic tribes with a number of towns, meaning fortresses, a catalog that was probably drafted in Bavaria in the 9th century as a sort of like an area for future expansion, right? So if we go into area X, how many tribes do we expect to see there? 5. And how many fortresses? In other words, how many fortresses we have to besiege, conquer, and so on and so forth. But that again is 9th century, it's very late.
In many cases, many throughout history, cultures, societies, civilizations are usually very spiritual, religiously connected. What do we know about the religions of the Slavic peoples before Christianity?
Excellent question. We know a bit, but again, those informations are problematic. Procopius mentioned that they have a god of the thunder, right, to whom they sacrifice cattle. They also worship divinities of the waters, right? Spirits of the waters, lakes and rivers and things like that. The problem with that, it's not much information, but the problem with that is that it looks suspiciously like an attempt to map onto the Slavs a mode of thinking that is basically Greek. In other words, he thinks of the Slavs, oh, they have a god like the ancient Greeks, right? Zeus, the god of the thunder. He does not see the Slavic religion as it is. He translates it, so to speak, for his audience, who cannot understand what the Slavs are doing unless you explain them in the terms of the books that they read, right, which are about ancient Greece. Very similar phenomenon later, much later on in the 10th and 11th century, in the northern part of Europe, in the area of present-day northern Germany and Poland, where there's an attempt by the Saxon expansion, German, right, Holy German Empire, moving eastwards, right, to convert those people, all of whom spoke Slavic. And we have some very interesting accounts. Titmar of Merseburg, Helmald of Bozau, and a number of other authors, all of whom, when they describe, for example, a temple, which certainly existed on the island of Rügen off the German coast in the Baltic Sea, they describe it in the terms of a ancient Greek temple. What can you do with that information? I mean, not much, right? Now, from an archaeological point of view, we know, however, of a few things. For example, there is clear evidence. There's a very good book coming out of Kiev, of all places, on magic in early Slavic religion, which is based exclusively on archaeology, right? Under the hearth, under the oven of any house, there's a little pot with some seeds inside, always millet, right? There is an animal or two under the foundation, or not foundation, because there's no foundation, right underneath. So before you dig up the pit for the house, there's another pit underneath one of the walls where an animal the skeleton of a little animal is deposed there. So there may be a sacrificial of some kind. On a number of sites, there are small statues made of clay, some of them in the form of an animal, like a cow or a horse, some of them in the form of humans that were found. What exactly their role is, we don't know. There are a number of hordes that have been found, especially in the middle Dnieper area of present-day Ukraine, south and north of Kiev, on both sides of the, in other words, in left bank and right bank in Ukraine, that contain small plaques made of metal in the form of dancing men, right? So this men, with their hands up like this and, with the legs spread, probably dancing. What is the significance of that? It's difficult to tell. In other words, the evidence that we have, the one, not the written one, which has problems, but the evidence that we have seems to point out to, I guess the word that I would use here is animistic, right? So in other words, there are spirits everywhere. There's no systematized religion. Don't think of it as like Christianity with a central God, with institutions, priests, and so on and so forth. The earliest we hear about Slavic priests in the pre-Christian era is the 10th century. So it's late. And it's most likely as a reaction to what they were seeing in Christianity, in other words, imitating that, right? Not genuinely Slavic as such.
And as we approach the end of this episode, I want to talk about legacy. From the time that they appear and they create their societies, they stratify, so on and so forth, what legacy do they create that'll stretch on from the Middle Ages even to today?
The most important one is the language. And let me explain, it's not just the surviving Slavic languages. That thing that Constantine / Saint Cyril did in the 860s, in the 60s of the 9th century, was an enormously influential thing. Because it created a language, not only for those people to express their devotion to God, liturgical books and whatnot, but it created a premise for an original and absolutely extraordinary different culture of Europe. So in the Middle Ages, from a cultural point of view, those people express themselves not just in a different language, but express ideas that are very specific. There is no parallel, for example, for Hrabre's on the letters, a treatise on defending the Glagolitic alphabet. You don't get anybody writing a defense of the Latin alphabet in the West. Similarly, you don't get a sermon on law and grace, in which I guess you get a number of sermons on contrasting the Old to the New Testament, law and grace. But in the process of doing that, future Metropolitan of Kiev, Hilarion, placed the Rus in history. Right? So he used that to sort of create the path for the Rus to enter biblical history. I already mentioned the authors of the Russian Primary Chronicle did exactly the same to place the Slavs in history. So all in all, this actually created an extraordinary rich and diverse environment, right? I mentioned Glagolitic, the alphabet that Hrabre defended in the 10th century with his On the Letters. That alphabet survived well into the 16th century in Croatia, of all places. There is a Croatian Glagolitism. Now, Croatians were Catholic, and they had to fight for the preservation of the right to preserve that language, to serve in the church, Slavonic, and to write that language with that alphabet. When Pope after Pope after Pope forbade them to do so. And in the era of rise to nationalism in the 19th century, that played an enormous role to them defining themselves as who they are. In Bulgaria, for example, this extraordinary effort of translations in the 10th century took place at the royal court at Preslav on the Sina. And the use of Old Slavonic for expressing a number of ideas fertilized generation after generation. In other words, at every single moment in the history of literature and general culture in Bulgaria, they looked back at the 10th century as a sort of like a point of inspiration of where to go from. There is even rock music in those bands in those countries that actually, modeled their music, so to speak, or use themes inspired by the Middle Ages, especially this creation of Slavic culture. In the Catholic countries that used, in the Slavic Catholic countries that used the Latin alphabet, Poland, Bohemia, Croatia I already mentioned. But in Poland, for example, one of the most interesting aspects, you mentioned legacy, right? One of the most interesting aspects of this is the fact that Christianity actually won in Poland so late. Like even by the 13th century, parts of Poland, especially the northeast, were not Christianized yet, right? So in the 19th century, any effort to rediscover an identity that was national meant at the same time trying to see what's underneath the Catholic layer, what's underneath because Christianity overlapped, was superposed over something that apparently survived. In Bohemia, right, the story of Przemysl, the plowman, and so on and so forth, is perceived as a purely, should I say, Slavic stuff. And, that created the mindset, right? We Slavs are not aristocrats and so on. So we're down-to-earth people, plowmen, In other words, it created a mindset, a model of casting yourself in the world, socially speaking, as somebody who actually has modest roots but can accomplish extraordinary feats.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight at the Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages, as we were joined by a phenomenal guest, Dr. Curta, who led us through a wonderful story spanning hundreds of years. And it's fascinating. I cannot thank him enough. And honestly, again, check out the links in the video description below, support his work, and really take advantage of the awesome mind that he has that helps me and you better understand the subjects that we all love. Dr. Curta, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.